Welcome to the Europe Conversation. My guest this week is Paschal Donohoe, Finance Minister of Ireland and President of the Eurogroup of Eurozone Finance Ministers. He says his country and several others are against the idea of a digital tax on the tech sector in response to Donald Trump's widespread tariffs, despite the fact that this is a very popular move in other countries like France. Paschal Donohoe, President of the Eurogroup and Finance Minister of Ireland, thank you very much for joining us on the Europe Conversation.
Shona, thank you for having me on.
Good. Well, look, let's start with the EU-US trade negotiations. We know that the EU has for some time now been offered a zero for zero tariff rate, but the US is not satisfied with that. It wants much greater access to the EU's markets when it comes to agriculture and other areas. And a lot of people would say that they'd like to see huge deregulation when it comes to the tech sector, the DSA, the DMA. Can you say that the EU is not for that, not for lowering standards for the sake of a deal?
So we're not for lowering standards for the sake of that. And we do have to have a debate and an assessment within the European Union regarding our competitiveness and the degree to which decisions that we have taken may have contributed to our competitiveness declining, with an impact on our growth, the impact on the number of jobs we may create in the future. So through that prism, it is important that we assess the regulations that we have and whether they are proportionate. But while I am convinced that an agreement between the EU and US is in the best interests of both, I certainly would take great care for a degree of deregulation being part of such an agreement.
So when you say competitiveness, then what could it look like without lowering standards, without reducing what's in the DSA and the DMA? What could it potentially look like in theory?
So I think there's a few strands for what it could look like. It could look like the efforts that we have in relation to the exchange of goods and the tariff levels for that. And what the EU have outlined as zero for zero is a very ambitious, but I believe important recognition of the value of trade and how it could be driven further. It could also look like commitments that we would have to buy more from each other in particular areas. And it could also look at what we could do in terms of the mutual recognition of the standards that each other have. And while that is easily and better understood with regard to goods, it could play a role with regard to services. This is a relationship, as you know, that's worth billions of euros every single day. And any change at all, no matter how small, that eases with the flow of that exchange of goods and services on a daily basis, on an annual basis, could be worth a big improvement to both of us.
We know that when the EU announced a couple of weeks ago its potential tariffs in the event that there's no negotiation led to, that digital services wasn't on that yet, but it potentially is on the table. Do you think that the reason why that's not there is because it's really a controversial part of the negotiations between the two sides?
So I believe it is understood as a move that, if it were to be applied, could have larger spillover effects. It could at that point become difficult to look at what would be paths for further de-escalation, and it could make a trade relationship, that which is obviously facing a very big challenge at the moment, face an even bigger one. Ireland and I have long-standing concerns regarding the role and use of digital services taxes, and my sense is that in the debate that is now taking place at the moment, it is understood as an option, but it's also understood as an option that could have very significant consequences.
Indeed, but countries like Germany and France, particularly France, would push for something like that.
And I think it's inevitable in a negotiation like this that is taking place, that different members of the European Union will have different views. That is, after all, I believe, our strength. And what we will do is listen to each other and find a balanced outcome regarding options that we may need to take now and other options that we might need to consider in the future. But I think it is fair to say that there are a group of countries within the European Union that would have significant concerns regarding the use of DSTs and the spillover effects that it could have on the trade negotiations and the health of the economic flows between the EU and US.
We know that the EU is also saying that regardless of what is the outcome of the next negotiations, it needs to seek stronger association with other markets, whether it's Canada and so on. But do you see there might be a renewal of the EU-China relationship as part of this?
We have acknowledged that China can be a partner in many areas, but we've also acknowledged that in other areas they do pose challenges for the European Union. And I think that continues to be the right balance. It is absolutely inevitable as we look at the unfortunate trade tension that is taking place between the US and the European Union. The European Union will look at other ways in which it can generate and deepen trade. We'll do that twofold. Firstly, through our own single market and our trade with each other. And secondly, looking elsewhere in the world and looking at deeper trading relationships that we can have there. I think it's important, however, to be realistic, to say that new trading agreements with other parts of the world, at least in the short term, aren't comparable to what we might be able to get out of the single market.
On the broader issue around trade with the EU and other countries trying to dash to not quite make up, but in some ways get stronger trade links across the world, do you think that there's a fear that the issues around global warming, human rights and other elements that used to be part of the priorities of a trade deal, that they will just be eliminated, in the demand for making up for what we're losing out at the moment?
So that risk is definitely there. And it is part of how the EU needs to be agile in responding back to a world that has changed so much. But we do have to stand by particular values and ways of engaging with the world that are important to us. I think it is likely in trade negotiations that will happen elsewhere that the reference that those particular issues would have got will, I fear, go down. But in what we need to do here in the EU, I certainly want to still ensure they have a high value. And I believe we can do that, and I believe we should do that.
So just moving on to defence, which obviously is the most important issue almost at the moment. You very much supported common borrowing when it came to COVID, because obviously you saw the impact it was having across Europe. Do you support the same for this existential crisis? Do you support common borrowing for defence?
I think in the time ahead, the most likely way in which further spending on defence will happen will be both at a national level in terms of the use of own national resources, and then secondly in the new framework that the EU have brought forward, where we would look at the use of the national escape clause where needed, and we would also look at new forms of lending to each other to help with new forms of spending.
So where's the trade-off? Because the defence spending has to go way up, and does that mean you take it out of CAP, or where does it come from? Cohesion funding?
So I think in the time ahead, national defence spending will continue to be the larger component of how we respond back to Europe's security needs. I hope and I expect from the discussions that I can see happening that will be happening in a more coordinated way that has happened in the past. And I also think it's likely that progress will be made in areas of procurement. Therefore, that means that if there is a defence dimension to the next MFF and the EU budget, I still think it's likely to be smaller than the national contribution that members make to their own security and the security of the EU. And therefore, it is possible that the knock-on effect that it will have on other priorities within the EU budget may be smaller than we think at the moment.
But, you speak to any Prime Minister, Foreign Affairs Minister, Defence Minister across Europe, they all say the same thing, that this needs to be a unified European response to this existential threat, that it actually has to be much bigger than what has been sort of offered in ReArm, and that it has to be European-wide.
It's difficult to have that debate and not divorce us from the broader reality that firstly, we'll be negotiating a budget for the new European Union. Secondly, Next Generation EU, which is the new form of common borrowing that we have to deal with the crisis of a number of years ago of the pandemic, that is still happening and still being evaluated. And debt in relation to all of that both still has to issue and still has to be refinanced and dealt with at some point in the future. All of those things are going to come together.
What's your assessment of the fact that Europe really has to do this alone now, because the US is telling Europe we were shifting the burden. We're not sharing the burden, we're shifting the burden of European security to the European continent alone?
I think that logic applies to so many elements now of the European Union, which is why I made the point to you there, Shona, that we can't have the debate about defence and security, as existential as it is, but have that debate without reference to very other big things that are going to happen now with regard to the EU. But a theme of what is now happening is the rules, the institutions that were set up in the aftermath of World War II, set up with American leadership. They're now being challenged, they're being contested. The institutions that we know, the rules in relation to trade and tax, are all now open for renegotiation. That is now what is happening.
Was Macron and Draghi right when they said Europe is mortal and it could die?
All political order is mortal. All political order, if not capable of dying, is capable of declining. That is one of the many lessons that we have from the study of history. The European Union is no different. If you believe progress is inevitable, you're on your way to seeing that progress decline.
Okay, just finally, you're coming up to the end of your second term as president of the Eurogroup. You're running for a third term. Have other countries declared that they're going to run against you, or what's the situation?
So no formal declarations have happened yet, but of course it's open to every country to decide do they want to put forward a candidate, or how do they want to vote. I'm really encouraged by the level of support that I have at the moment, but really all my focus is on completing my current mandate, which takes me all up to July, and then on the basis of my track record, asking countries to continue to support me in that work. And we've a few weeks to go before we get to that point. And as we have just discussed, an awful lot can happen in a number of weeks in the world that we're in. But I am encouraged by the support I've currently received.
OK, well, Paschal Donohoe, Finance Minister for Ireland and President of the Eurogroup, thank you very much for joining us on the Europe Conversation.
Thank you, Shona.